Stephanie Isaacson. On the morning of June 1st, 1989, a teenager was seized while traveling her customary route to El Dorado High School in Las Vegas, Nevada. Stephanie Isaacson never reached her destination that day, immediately raising alarm among her relatives and educators who recognized her as dependable and conscientious. Her belongings and school supplies were discovered strewn across a desolate expanse near her walking path, ultimately guiding search parties to her remains. She had suffered a vicious assault that sent shockwaves through the Las Vegas metropolitan area and initiated an inquiry that would persist for more than 30 years before achieving closure. Crime scene specimens were gathered utilizing the forensic techniques accessible during the late 1980s, though genetic identification technology remained in its developmental infancy and wasn't yet broadly implemented in criminal prosecutions. Biological material was safeguarded from the location. Despite the specimen being extraordinarily minute, measuring merely 0.12 nanograms, roughly equivalent to 15 cellular units of hereditary material. This microscopic quantity would ultimately prove both problematic and fundamentally vital to resolving the investigation decades afterward, constituting one of the smallest genetic specimens ever successfully examined in forensic history. Detectives questioned countless individuals throughout the weeks and months subsequent to Stephanie's demise, encompassing classmates from her educational institution, residents from her neighborhood, and anyone who potentially occupied the vicinity that morning. They pursued multiple investigative threads and examined correlations to additional incidents in the Las Vegas region, including another devastating occurrence from 1986 involving a victim identified as Nanette Vanderberg. Stay with us. You won't believe how cutting-edge science finally cracked this seemingly impossible case after 3 decades. Despite exhaustive endeavors and unwavering commitment from investigators, no perpetrator could be conclusively identified employing the investigative instruments and forensic competencies available during that period. The investigation progressively grew dormant as promising leads were depleted and fresh intelligence ceased emerging, though it was never formally abandoned or dismissed by the detectives who had dedicated themselves to it for 32 years. The minimal evidence persisted in meticulously regulated preservation, while genetic identification technology progressed dramatically throughout the surrounding period. The pivotal breakthrough ultimately materialized in 2021 when a community member named Justin Wu, profoundly affected by Stephanie's narrative, contributed $5,000 to finance sophisticated genetic testing through Othram Labs, a corporation specializing in extracting hereditary information from exceptionally deteriorated or minimal specimens that alternative laboratories might classify as impossible to analyze. The facility successfully sequenced the minuscule genetic sample, employing state-of-the-art technology unavailable when Stephanie perished. Investigators uploaded the genetic profile to public repositories, where it underwent comparison against millions of hereditary profiles submitted by individuals innocently investigating their lineage and ancestral backgrounds. The analysis revealed a correspondence to relatives of Darren Roy Marchand, a Las Vegas inhabitant who had been scrutinized in connection with the 1986 Vanderberg incident, but never prosecuted due to inadequate evidence at that juncture. Supplementary genetic specimens preserved from the earlier investigation were retrieved and examined, confirming Marchand as Stephanie's killer with scientific certainty. However, conventional justice proved unattainable. Marchand had taken his own existence in 1995, merely 6 years following Stephanie's death and 26 years preceding his identification through genetic genealogy. The resolution delivered complex and agonizing emotions for Stephanie's relatives, who had endured over 3 decades awaiting answers. Her mother articulated relief at finally discovering who bore responsibility. though she simultaneously acknowledged the harsh reality that genuine justice for Stephanie remained forever elusive. Sarah Yarborough. On December 14, 1991, 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough arrived at Federal Way High School near Seattle, Washington, for drill team rehearsal. Sarah exemplified academic excellence and demonstrated unwavering dedication to her performance squad. Arriving ahead of schedule that morning to prepare for practice, she secured her vehicle and commenced walking toward the facility when someone intercepted her. She never crossed the threshold inside. Sarah's remains were located in shrubbery on school property. Her drill team attire had been partially displaced, and biological evidence was discovered on her garments. The location suggested she had vigorously resisted her assailant, with personal items scattered throughout the area indicating a fierce struggle. Investigators determined the assault was predatory in character, with the perpetrator apparently lying in wait for a vulnerable target. The inquiry involved comprehensive interviews with students, faculty, and anyone present on or adjacent to school grounds that morning. Physical evidence was collected and preserved, including biological material yielding a genetic profile. Despite pursuing numerous investigative avenues and scrutinizing various individuals, detectives proved unable to identify a suspect. The case persisted as unsolved for nearly 3 decades, haunting the Federal Way community and Sarah's grieving family. Keep watching. The breakthrough in this case reveals a disturbing pattern that should have been stopped years earlier. The transformative breakthrough emerged in 2019 when forensic genetic genealogy was applied to the investigation. Identifiers International, an enterprise specializing in this methodology, uploaded the perpetrator's genetic profile to GEDmatch and alternative genealogy databases. The analysis identified potential relatives and enabled genealogists to construct detailed family lineages extending back multiple generations. This meticulous process directed investigators to Patrick Leon Nicholas, who had been 27 during Sarah's death. Nicholas possessed a documented criminal background that should have triggered immediate concerns. He had been convicted of attempted assault against a woman in 1983 and subsequently faced charges related to inappropriate contact with a minor in 1993. His behavioral pattern involved approaching women near vehicles and employing intimidation tactics. Despite these convictions, he had been released and lived freely when Sarah was killed. To verify the genetic genealogy findings, investigators conducted surveillance and collected items Nicholas had discarded. Genetic material from a napkin and cigarette remnant matched the crime scene evidence with odds of 1 in 120 quadrillion, furnishing definitive scientific proof of his involvement. When investigators interviewed Nicholas following his arrest, he posed questions that investigators found revealing about his awareness of the case. Nicholas was prosecuted and in 2023 received a sentence of 45 years in prison. The conviction delivered relief to Sarah's family after 28 years of waiting. However, the case also raised troubling questions about how Nicholas had been permitted to harm Sarah despite his prior convictions. A disturbing reality that the system had released him after his 1983 conviction, providing him the opportunity to take Sarah's life 8 years later. Crystal Beslanowicz. On December 19, 1995, 17-year-old Crystal Beslanowicz was discovered deceased on the frozen shoreline of the Provo River in Utah. Crystal had been socializing with companions earlier that evening before the encounter that terminated her life. The location was discovered by individuals in the area, and investigators responded to find evidence suggesting a violent confrontation had transpired. The location presented distinctive challenges for evidence collection. The terrain was rocky and partially frozen, rendering the documentation and preservation of potential evidence extraordinarily difficult. Nevertheless, investigators meticulously processed the scene, collecting items including rocks and additional materials that might bear biological evidence. Traditional genetic testing methods available in the mid-1990s yielded limited results from the collected specimens. The investigation encompassed interviewing Crystal's friends and acquaintances to establish a chronology of her final hours. Detectives explored various theories and followed leads, but no definitive suspect emerged from the initial investigation. The case grew cold, though the evidence was carefully maintained in storage with the aspiration that advancing technology might someday provide new investigative opportunities. For 18 years, the case remained unsolved. In 2013, investigators decided to re-examine the physical evidence utilizing a relatively innovative technique called MVAC technology. This method employs a specialized vacuum to extract genetic material from porous surfaces like rocks and wood that traditional swabbing might overlook. The MVAC was applied to rocks collected from the scene, successfully recovering hereditary material that had not been detected by earlier testing methodologies. Subscribe now to discover how a revolutionary vacuum technology solved what seemed like an impossible case. The genetic profile was compared against databases and yielded a match to Joseph Michael Simpson, an individual who had been convicted of another serious offense in 1987. The database correspondence provided investigators with probable cause to obtain additional specimens from Simpson, which confirmed the match. Further investigation revealed that Simpson had been in the Provo vicinity at the time of Crystal's death, positioning him at the scene. Simpson was arrested and charged with Crystal's murder. During the legal proceedings, forensic specialists testified about the MVAC technology and how it had recovered hereditary material that earlier methods had failed to detect. The scientific evidence was compelling, demonstrating how the perpetrator's genetic material had been transferred to the rocks during the encounter with Crystal. Additional genetic material was also discovered beneath Crystal's fingernails, suggesting she had fought against her attacker with remarkable courage. In 2016, Simpson was convicted and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought closure to Crystal's family after 2 decades of waiting for answers. The case became significant in forensic science circles for demonstrating the effectiveness of MVAC technology in recovering genetic material from challenging surfaces. It also revealed the disturbing pattern of Simpson's escalating behavior, with Crystal's case connected to an earlier offense from 1987. Arliss Perry. On October 12, 1974, 19-year-old Arliss Perry was discovered deceased inside Stanford Memorial Church on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California. Arliss was a newlywed who had recently relocated to California with her husband while he pursued his education at Stanford. She had entered the church alone around 11:30 that evening, intending to pray in solitude. When she failed to return home, her husband went searching for her and notified campus security. The discovery was made by a security guard who found the church's entrances secured from the interior. Upon entering, he discovered Arliss in a disturbing scene that suggested ritualistic elements. She had been positioned in a specific manner, and various items from the church had been arranged around her body. The nature of the scene led investigators to consider various theories about the perpetrator's motivations and whether this might be connected to other incidents. The investigation was extensive, involving interviews with hundreds of individuals connected to Stanford and the surrounding community. Detectives explored possible connections to other incidents and investigated whether the crime possessed cult or ritualistic significance. Despite collecting physical evidence, including clothing and biological material, investigators were unable to identify a suspect using the forensic methods available in the mid-1970s. The case became one of Stanford's most infamous unsolved mysteries, haunting the university community for decades. Arliss's family endured 44 years without answers, never knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted. Various theories circulated throughout the years, but none led to a definitive identification of the perpetrator. Don't go anywhere. The shocking revelation of who killed Arliss will leave you speechless. The breakthrough emerged in 2018 when genetic evidence from clothing discovered at the scene was analyzed using modern techniques and compared against genetic databases. The analysis identified a match to Stephen Blake Crawford, an individual who had worked as a security guard at Stanford at the time of Arliss's death. This revelation was profoundly shocking because Crawford had occupied a position of trust on campus and would have possessed access to buildings, including the church. Investigators began preparing to arrest Crawford and interrogate him about the case. However, when officers approached his residence to execute the arrest warrant, events took an unexpected turn. Crawford took his own life as police closed in, preventing any interrogation or trial. The suicide meant that many questions about his motivations and whether he was connected to other cases would never be answered. The resolution brought complicated emotions for Arliss's family. While they finally knew who had killed her, Crawford's death denied them the opportunity to hear him explain his actions or to witness him face justice in a courtroom. The case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect, providing answers after 44 years, but leaving some questions forever unanswered. The disturbing element was that someone entrusted with campus security had been responsible for one of Stanford's most notorious crimes. On October 12, 1974, 19-year-old Arliss Perry was discovered deceased inside Stanford Memorial Church on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California. Arliss was a newlywed who had recently relocated to California with her husband while he pursued his education at Stanford. She had entered the church alone around 11:30 that evening, intending to pray in solitude. When she failed to return home, her husband went searching for her and notified campus security. The discovery was made by a security guard who found the church's entrances secured from the interior. Upon entering, he discovered Arliss in a disturbing scene that suggested ritualistic elements. She had been positioned in a specific manner, and various items from the church had been arranged around her body. The nature of the scene led investigators to consider various theories about the perpetrator's motivations and whether this might be connected to other incidents. The investigation was extensive, involving interviews with hundreds of individuals connected to Stanford and the surrounding community. Detectives explored possible connections to other incidents and investigated whether the crime possessed cult or ritualistic significance. Despite collecting physical evidence, including clothing and biological material, investigators were unable to identify a suspect using the forensic methods available in the mid-1970s. The case became one of Stanford's most infamous unsolved mysteries, haunting the university community for decades. Arliss's family endured 44 years without answers, never knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted. Various theories circulated throughout the years, but none led to a definitive identification of the perpetrator. Don't go anywhere. The shocking revelation of who killed Arliss will leave you speechless. The breakthrough emerged in 2018 when genetic evidence from clothing discovered at the scene was analyzed using modern techniques and compared against genetic databases. The analysis identified a match to Stephen Blake Crawford, an individual who had worked as a security guard at Stanford at the time of Arliss's death. This revelation was profoundly shocking because Crawford had occupied a position of trust on campus and would have possessed access to buildings, including the church. Investigators began preparing to arrest Crawford and interrogate him about the case. However, when officers approached his residence to execute the arrest warrant, events took an unexpected turn. Crawford took his own life as police closed in, preventing any interrogation or trial. The suicide meant that many questions about his motivations and whether he was connected to other cases would never be answered. The resolution brought complicated emotions for Arliss's family. While they finally knew who had killed her, Crawford's death denied them the opportunity to hear him explain his actions or to witness him face justice in a courtroom. The case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect, providing answers after 44 years, but leaving some questions forever unanswered. The disturbing element was that someone entrusted with campus security had been responsible for one of Stanford's most notorious crimes. Sophie Sergey. On April 26, 1993, 20-year-old Sophie Sergey was discovered deceased in a bathtub at a dormitory on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. Sophie was not enrolled as a student at the university, but had been visiting friends who resided in the dormitory. She had gone to utilize the bathroom facilities and never returned. Her body was discovered by a dormitory resident, and the scene displayed evidence of a violent encounter. The investigation revealed that Sophie had been harmed in multiple ways, including being shot. The violence appeared sudden and unprovoked, suggesting the perpetrator may have encountered her opportunistically in the bathroom facility. Investigators collected biological evidence from the scene and commenced interviewing dormitory residents and anyone who had been on campus that evening. Despite these extensive efforts, no suspect was identified in the initial investigation. The case grew cold for 26 years, becoming one of Alaska's most frustrating unsolved cases. Sophie's family, who originated from a small Alaskan community, endured decades without knowing who had killed her or why. The randomness of the attack made it particularly difficult for them to process, as Sophie had simply been visiting friends and using a bathroom facility when she was targeted. The breakthrough materialized in 2019 when investigators applied genetic genealogy to hereditary evidence from the scene. The genetic profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and specialists began constructing family trees to identify potential matches. The analysis led to relatives of Stephen Downs, a nurse living in Maine who had been a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the time of Sophie's death. Keep watching to see how justice finally caught up with a killer hiding across the country for 26 years. Further investigation revealed that Downs had been residing in the same dormitory where Sophie was found. He had been a fellow student who would have possessed regular access to the building and its facilities. Investigators traveled to Maine to interview Downs and collect a genetic specimen for comparison. The sample confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested, providing definitive proof of his involvement in Sophie's death. Downs was extradited to Alaska to face charges. During the legal proceedings, he maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming genetic evidence. The prosecution presented testimony about the genetic genealogy process and how it had identified Downs, as well as traditional forensic evidence connecting him to the scene. The defense attempted to challenge the use of genealogy databases, raising privacy concerns about the practice. In 2022, Downs was convicted and received a sentence of 75 years in prison. He has filed appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction, including the use of genetic genealogy and the handling of hereditary evidence. As of 2025, these appeals remain under consideration by courts. For Sophie's family, the conviction provided answers and justice after 26 years. though the randomness of the attack and Downs' lack of remorse made the resolution bittersweet. Linda Slatton. On September 13, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slatton was discovered deceased in her Lakeland, Florida residence where she lived with her family. Linda was a devoted mother who had been following her normal routine when she was attacked in her own home. Her young son was present in the residence, but was physically unharmed during the incident, though the trauma of that day would affect him for the remainder of his life. The discovery was made by family members who arrived at the home, and the scene displayed evidence of a violent encounter that had occurred inside what should have been a safe sanctuary. Investigators from the Lakeland Police Department collected physical evidence from the residence, including biological material that yielded a genetic profile using the forensic methods available in the early 1980s. They interviewed neighbors who might have observed someone approaching or departing the property, family members who knew Linda's daily routines and relationships, and anyone else who might have information about her activities or who might have been in the area that day. Despite extensive investigation involving hundreds of hours of detective work, no suspect was identified using the forensic tools and databases available in the early 1980s. The case eventually grew cold, leaving Linda's family without answers for nearly 4 decades. For Linda's son, growing up without knowing who had killed his mother was particularly difficult and shaped his entire childhood. He lived with the mystery throughout his formative years and into adulthood, wondering if he would ever learn the truth about what had happened that September day. Subscribe and hit the bell. The twist in this case is one of the most disturbing betrayals you'll ever hear. The breakthrough finally materialized in 2019 when genetic genealogy was applied to Linda's case. The genetic profile from the scene was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and specialists began the painstaking process of constructing detailed family trees to identify the perpetrator. The analysis led investigators to Joseph Clinton Mills, a name that would prove particularly shocking and painful to Linda's family when they learned his identity and his connection to their lives. Mills had been a youth football coach in the Lakeland area during the years following Linda's death. Most disturbingly, he had coached Linda's son during the boy's childhood, serving as a mentor figure and trusted adult in the child's life during the very years when he was trying to process his mother's loss. He had been present at games and practices, interacting with the family and community, all while keeping the secret of what he had done to Linda. The revelation that Mills had been responsible for Linda's death while simultaneously coaching her son was deeply disturbing and represented a profound betrayal of trust that extended beyond the original crime. Investigators conducted careful surveillance of Mills and collected items he had discarded to confirm the genetic genealogy findings without alerting him to the investigation. The genetic comparison provided definitive scientific proof of his involvement and additional evidence, including a palm print recovered from the crime scene, connected him physically to Linda's home on the day of her death. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Mills was arrested and charged with Linda's murder 38 years after the fact. During the legal proceedings in 2022, prosecutors presented the genetic evidence along with detailed testimony about how Mills had inserted himself into the family's life after killing Linda. The calculated nature of the betrayal was emphasized as an aggravating factor that demonstrated Mills's character and lack of remorse. Mills was convicted after a trial where the jury heard about both the scientific evidence and the disturbing pattern of his behavior after the crime. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be released. For Linda's son, now an adult with his own family, the resolution brought answers he had sought his entire life, but also forced him to confront the painful reality that someone he had trusted and looked up to as a youth had been his mother's killer all along. Janelle Cruz. On May 4th, 1986, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was discovered deceased in her Irvine, California residence where she had been house-sitting for her family while they were away on vacation. Janelle was a responsible and dependable young woman who had been entrusted to oversee the home during her family's absence, a task she had performed previously without any complications. When family members returned from their trip and discovered what had happened in their home, they were devastated to learn that their residence had become the site of such a terrible crime against someone they loved. The scene displayed evidence of a violent encounter, and investigators from the Orange County Sheriff's Department responded immediately to process the evidence and commence their investigation. Biological evidence was collected from the scene using the forensic methods available in the mid-1980s, including specimens that would later prove crucial to solving the case. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood extensively, interviewed neighbors who might have witnessed suspicious activity or unfamiliar vehicles in the area, and explored various leads that emerged during the investigation. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. However, despite extensive efforts and hundreds of hours of detective work, no suspect was identified at that time using the investigative tools and databases available. What investigators did not know in 1986 was that Janelle's case was connected to a much larger and more terrifying pattern of crimes that had terrorized California communities throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The perpetrator responsible for Janelle's death had committed numerous offenses across multiple counties in the state, though authorities investigating in different jurisdictions had not yet connected all the cases to a single individual. The various police departments and sheriff's offices working different incidents had not realized they were all hunting the same person who had been operating across Northern and Southern California for over a decade. For 32 years, Janelle's case remained officially unsolved, though investigators periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. The genetic profile from the scene was compared against databases, but no matches were found. The case seemed destined to remain cold indefinitely, as the perpetrator had apparently stopped committing crimes and vanished without a trace. The breakthrough came in 2018 when genetic genealogy was applied to the hereditary evidence in a groundbreaking investigation that would change criminal justice forever. Investigators uploaded the perpetrator's genetic profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, and began building extensive family trees going back multiple generations. This painstaking work led to Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer living in suburban Sacramento. D'Angelo had been born in 1945 and had served in the military before becoming a police officer. He had worked in law enforcement during some of the years when he was actively committing crimes, using his knowledge of police procedures to avoid detection. After being terminated from a police department in 1979, he had continued his pattern before apparently stopping in the late 1980s. He then lived quietly for 3 decades, raising a family and working in various jobs while keeping his past hidden. When investigators conducted surveillance and collected genetic material from items D'Angelo discarded, the comparison confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested. He was arrested in April 2018 and charged not only with Janelle's case, but with numerous other offenses spanning years. The arrest solved dozens of cases across California that had haunted communities for decades. D'Angelo became known as the Golden State Killer, a name that encompassed his various crime sprees. Rather than face trial, D'Angelo entered a plea agreement in 2020 to avoid the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to multiple cases and received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, victims and family members from dozens of cases gave impact statements describing decades of trauma and fear. For Janelle's family, the resolution came 34 years after her death, and they learned their case was part of a much larger pattern. In 2025, a book was published providing new details about the investigation, offering insights into how D'Angelo had evaded capture for so long. The disturbing element was that a former police officer had used his training to commit crimes and avoid detection for decades, and that someone who appeared to be a normal suburban grandfather had been responsible for such extensive harm. Annette Schnee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer. On January 6, 1982, two women disappeared while attempting to secure rides on the same evening near Breckenridge, Colorado, during harsh winter conditions. 21-year-old Annette Schnee and 29-year-old Bobby Joe Oberholzer had been in the area separately, both attempting to hitchhike or catch rides during a bitterly cold winter night when temperatures were dangerously low. Neither woman arrived at her intended destination, and both were reported missing by concerned family and friends who knew something was seriously wrong when they failed to make contact or return home. Annette's body was discovered months later in a remote wooded area after the snow had melted in the spring, while Bobby Joe's was found in a different location some distance away. Both women had been shot, and evidence suggested they had been picked up by the same person on that January night, though they had been at different locations and did not know each other. Investigators collected evidence from both scenes, including biological material and other physical evidence like shell casings, and began the difficult task of trying to identify who had encountered both women separately on the same evening. Keep watching. The ironic twist in this double murder case is absolutely chilling. The investigation involved extensive interviews with residents of the Breckenridge area and following numerous leads over the years that followed. Detectives explored various theories about who might have been driving in the area that night, with opportunity to encounter both women at different times, and they examined records of vehicles and people who had been in the vicinity. Despite decades of work and periodic reviews of the case file, no suspect was definitively identified using traditional investigative methods and databases. The case became one of Colorado's most frustrating, unsolved double homicides, haunting investigators who worked on it. The investigation took an ironic and disturbing turn when authorities uncovered records from the night of the crimes. On that same January night in 1982, a man had become stuck in a snowdrift not far from where the women had last been seen. Rescue personnel had responded and helped free the man's vehicle from the snow, sending him safely on his way. Decades later, investigators would learn the chilling truth about who that stranded motorist had been. The breakthrough came in 2021 when hereditary evidence from the crime scenes was analyzed using genetic genealogy. The analysis led to Alan Lee Phillips, a miner who had been living in the Breckenridge area at the time. Further investigation revealed that Phillips was the same person who had been rescued from the snowdrift on the night of the crimes. Authorities had unknowingly helped the killer get his vehicle unstuck after he had harmed the two women. When confronted with the genetic evidence, Phillips was arrested and charged with both homicides. Additional evidence, including blood correspondence and hereditary material from items Phillips had discarded, confirmed his involvement. The case proceeded to trial where prosecutors presented the genetic evidence, along with circumstantial evidence placing Phillips in the area and demonstrating his opportunity to encounter both women. Phillips was convicted and received 2 life sentences in 2022. However, the disturbing ending took another turn when Phillips died by his own hand while incarcerated in prison shortly after his conviction. The suicide meant that he would never serve out his full sentences or potentially provide information about whether there were other victims. For the families of Annette and Bobby Joe, the resolution brought answers after 40 years. But Phillips's death denied them the full justice of seeing him serve his sentences. The most chilling aspect was the irony that rescue personnel had helped him on the very night he had committed the crimes. Danielle Hutchins. On September 24, 1996, a young girl disappeared from the Huntley area of Montana, sparking an immediate search involving law enforcement and community volunteers. Danielle Hutchins had been spending time in the area and was last seen before vanishing without a trace. Her disappearance triggered fears throughout the small Montana community, and search teams combed through fields and wooded areas looking for any sign of her. Her body was discovered in a field days later, ending hopes that she might still be found alive. Evidence collected from the scene included biological material that was preserved using the forensic methods available in the mid-1990s. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals in the community, explored various theories, and followed leads, but no suspect was identified despite extensive efforts. The case grew cold, leaving Danielle's family without answers for nearly 3 decades. The evidence from Danielle's case remained in storage as genetic identification technology advanced over the following decades. Cold case investigators periodically reviewed the file, hoping that new techniques might provide the breakthrough needed to identify the perpetrator. The breakthrough came in 2024 when genetic genealogy was applied to hair evidence from the case. Hereditary material was successfully extracted from the hair samples and uploaded to genealogy databases where specialists began building family trees to identify potential suspects. The analysis led investigators to Paul Hutchinson, who had been a student in the Huntley area at the time of Danielle's death. Don't click away. What happens next in this investigation will shock you. Hutchinson had been living quietly in Montana for nearly 3 decades, seemingly leading a normal life with no apparent connection to any criminal activity. When investigators identified him through genetic genealogy, they approached him for an interview to discuss the case. Hutchinson agreed to speak with investigators, and during that interview, they confronted him with the hereditary evidence linking him to Danielle's case. However, before charges could be filed or the investigation could be completed, Hutchinson died by his own hand shortly after the interview with law enforcement. His suicide came as investigators were building their case and preparing to present evidence to prosecutors. The timing suggested he knew the genetic evidence was irrefutable and chose to avoid facing justice rather than be held accountable. Hutchinson's wife spoke publicly after his death, expressing shock at the allegations and describing the husband she had known for years who bore no resemblance to someone capable of such an act. Her statements reflected the common theme in many of these cases, where family members of perpetrators struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the crimes they committed. For Danielle's family, the resolution was bittersweet. The hereditary evidence had definitively identified who was responsible after 28 years, but Hutchinson's suicide meant there would never be a trial, no public accounting of what happened, and no opportunity for the family to confront him or hear him explain his actions. The case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect, providing answers but denying traditional justice. Marilyn Decker. On February 18, 1987, 33-year-old Marilyn Decker was discovered deceased in her Davie, Florida apartment. Marilyn had been following her normal routine when she was attacked in her own home. The discovery was made when she failed to appear for expected appointments, prompting concerned friends to check on her welfare. The scene displayed evidence of a violent encounter, and investigators from the Davie Police Department responded to process the evidence. Biological evidence was collected from the scene, including hair samples that were preserved using the forensic methods available in the late 1980s. Investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have information about Marilyn's activities or who might have been in the area. They explored various theories and followed leads, but despite extensive efforts, no suspect was identified using the investigative tools available at that time. The case grew cold, joining thousands of other unsolved homicides from that era. For 38 years, Marilyn's case remained unsolved. Her family endured decades without knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted in her own home. The evidence remained carefully stored, waiting for technology to advance enough to provide new investigative opportunities. Detectives who worked cold cases periodically reviewed the file, but without a viable suspect or new leads, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. The breakthrough came in 2025 when genetic testing was performed on the preserved hair samples using advanced techniques that had not existed when Marilyn died. The analysis successfully extracted hereditary material from the hair shafts and created a genetic profile that could be compared against databases. The comparison yielded a match to Donald Lawless, an individual with an extensive criminal history who had been active in the Broward County area. Further investigation revealed that Lawless had died in 1995, just 8 years after Marilyn's death and 30 years before being identified as her killer. Records showed that Lawless had been involved in various criminal activities throughout his life, suggesting a pattern of behavior that had escalated to the most serious level with Marilyn's case. His death from natural causes meant he had never been held accountable for what he had done to Marilyn. The identification of Lawless brought closure to Marilyn's family after 38 years of waiting. They finally knew who was responsible and could process their loss with that knowledge. However, Lawless's death decades earlier meant there would never be a trial. No opportunity to hear him explain his actions, and no formal justice through the court system. The case was officially closed in 2025 as exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. The disturbing element was that Lawless had lived for 8 more years after Marilyn's death, potentially committing other offenses before dying, and had escaped any consequences for what he had done. The case demonstrated both the power of modern genetic technology to solve decades-old crimes and the frustration that comes when perpetrators die before advanced science catches up to them.